Okay, hello everyone. There's the clicker. First thing, just the scale of the market, or the industry that we're in, the numbers there from Statista, 500 billion pounds globally. If we try and imagine that, it's about the same, actually it's a little more than the GDP of Norway. It's absolutely enormous. If we look at the channel optimization, and sort of dovetailing with what Jill was saying, there'll be a little overlap in truth, but I'll skip over those charts that you seem to have updated and I haven't on my actual. The scale of the prize in getting the channel mix right is absolutely huge. It's actually bigger than the GDP globally. The global upside is bigger than the GDP of Slovenia. So enormous figures in getting these calculations and these balances correct. We've done a lot of work at Ebiquity in looking at the efficiencies globally and also locally in the UK. This figure here of 450 million is looking at right-sizing and correctly allocating, actually just in 3 industry verticals, of getting those plans correct. So the financial impact of this is absolutely enormous. Just to introduce Ebiquity, based on the fact that nearly everyone in the hall is from the agencies, I'm sure you know who we are, but the key point to say here is that in what we do, in the associations that we have, that we're independent. We have no vested interest whatsoever. We do not transact in the media value chain whatsoever. So it's just issuing clarity and advice to advertisers about the right spending decisions. And I'll go on to some of the numbers that would fuel that advice. And as I say, I think a lot of the theme is what Jill was talking very eloquently about first up. So one of the big challenges in the industry is increasing short-termism. And I think it manifests itself in different ways. I'll skip quickly through this because Jill did the whole presentation on this. But again, there's consumer dynamics. Obviously, the internet is out there, a lot more interaction with it. Consumers can sort of seamlessly flip between the online and offline world. Again, companies investing in data-driven, measurable channels. I think digital metrics are often like sort of methamphetamines for marketers. They just cannot get enough of it. It's coming out every day. But very often, it's the wrong metrics. And I'll go on to look at a couple of charts on that. And it is very puzzling very often, therefore, for marketers to make the correct decisions when there aren't comparable metrics, and very often when there isn't, and it's really the industry that I represent in terms of the measurement industry, sometimes makes it very confusing for marketers to make the right calls as to how to put those investment plans together. And I'll explain a little about that as we go through. Short-termism, that's the measurement defective. And I think very often the long-term role of advertising, the long-term financial benefit of advertising, particularly broadcast brand advertising, is being put into question significantly at the moment. Pleasingly, and I think Sam from DLG, I haven't seen this talk, hopefully you might talk about that a little later, but a lot of the work that we do now is to look at the long-term impact and really what drives it, what campaigns drive it. If you think, I'm sure you've all encountered some sort of econometric or marketing mix output, and you might have base sales, you might have the impact of price, promotions, distribution, and perhaps short-term impact of media. But typically for many strong businesses, the base actually is the biggest component. And the big question, therefore, is how do you drive the base in the long term? Which campaigns, which consumer perception metrics actually lead through to the challenge that Michael was saying about increasing awareness and therefore conversion? Well, it's not just the what in terms of the measurement of it, how big is it, but it's also the why and what's the pathway to get there. Okay, so it's making the point, and as I say, of going down the wrong path with those splits in terms of short term versus long term. And again, just some figures, similar charts, hopefully very similar figures, it's the same point. That, you know, in terms of the hours and days, 18% coming through from advertising, but, you know, 42% over weeks and months, 100% altogether. So only a fraction of the effect, when you talk about this methamphetamine effect of digital media and metrics, you're only capturing part of it. And certainly with you know, broadcast media and brand campaigns, the majority of it is in the future. So there's a number of, you know, the status at the moment. You know, advertisers have been herded to the direct sell. What we are finding alongside that is that marketing effectiveness is falling. I'll show you some numbers. I expect you've seen some of those numbers before. And in terms of the long-term growth of brands, it's therefore clearly been put at risk. I'll skip over that because that's the one that I think are pretty much the same numbers, but you've updated yours for the latest year, and I haven't, which is a note to myself. But there's the evidence. We've seen it on two charts now, that you're moving from brand advertising, a massive switch. And I've seen, you know, the equivalent figures in different Western markets, all showing the same trend. Peter Field, in some of the work through analysing IPA papers, making the point that, you know, it's turned into deal time and that's harming brands' profitability. And there's evidence of that over the analysis of the IPA papers. That's the effect. It was increasing. But actually, particularly with, you know, that growth in digital media and that growth in focus of the content focusing on the short term, what we are seeing is that marketing effectiveness is declining. You know, part of the reason behind that massive 450 million opportunity in the UK just on 3 industry verticals. But I think, you know, the confusion around the metrics is really difficult. You know, I've worked in a media agency myself for a very long time before moving to Ebiquity, and advertisers are incredibly confused, and a lot of these metrics are used very much in the wrong context. If you look at impressions there, so you've got sort of, you know, YouTube, Facebook, etc. You know, you can make the point that actually getting your message out, perhaps through Facebook, if you take that as an example, is actually cheaper than the all adults, you know, cost per thousand of TV. And it's sort of 5 versus 3 for Facebook. But then, if you work that through and say, well, how many are viewable? How many are audible and completed? Then actually the cost of getting sort of quality messaging through is very different from the headline statistic that is often being quoted to advertisers. And I think on top of that, the tech giants are coming out with some very, very misleading phrases. So there from Google, brands should spend 24% of the TV ad budgets on YouTube. And my team does a huge amount of mixed modelling. We've never seen that. Just be clear about that. We have never seen a figure approaching that. I'm not saying that that YouTube cannot deliver. Yes, it can, but as soon as you start to spend a lot of money on it, it saturates very quickly. We have never had a situation where that would be true in literally thousands of models that we've built. Again, Facebook coming out with misleading quotes, and again, there, you know, better ROIs on YouTube. It is ordinarily not the case. It can be the case at very low spend levels on occasions, but it is typically not the case. So I think when we think about media plans, I'm very conscious of, you know, most of the audience come from sort of media planning agencies, is that, you know, they should be and could be effectiveness-led. This idea of, you know, half your advertising is wasted, we don't know which half, you know, that was written nearly 100 years ago. You know, it can all be measured now. There is no excuse not to put effectiveness-led plans in place. But it's often difficult. If you think about ROI and you're using that at, you know, a board level within companies, the usual definition is the accountancy definition above. It's the incremental value divided by the cost that gives the payback calculation. But it's often easier to think about and explain it to clients in terms of the bottom definition, where it's fundamentally a function of the cost of reach times by the effectiveness of reach point. And then if you think about those misleading metrics, the cost of reach of Facebook initially looks as more effective or cheaper ultimately than the cost of TV, even on a sort of all adults buy. But the reality is the effectiveness per reach point. When you say, well, how many of them are viewed and completed, you can start to understand the second part of that. The effectiveness per reach point is significantly depleted, and that is why it is less effective. And really, when you think about it for TV, when you think of all of the factors in its favour, the scale of the reach, the viewability, the fact that that's audited, you kind of think in the first place, you stand back from this, you think, well, it should be Usain Bolt winning the Olympics. And I'll go on to look at the evidence. I'm conscious of the fact that the audience, I might get lynched for that title, but it's not. There is sort of misperceptions in the industry, and this came through from FigBooks, and I think it's some work initially done by Ipsos, wasn't it, that did the research behind this. But just if you take a look at, so the question is where people see advertising that they like, and actually you can look down the list, but particularly the last two to focus on. That the perception in Adland, which are the yellow figures, is significantly depleted when you look at the balance between social and TV. There's about a sort of 8 times difference between the reality and the market for many of the questions on that survey versus what not just people in media agencies but marketing as well think about those numbers. And as you say, the actual money when you're investing, I expect you may have seen this slide before, it's published a year ago, from Ebiquity and Firm Decisions. But in terms of the ad spend, in terms of the money getting through, ultimately with all the demand side and agency trading desk fees, actually there is very little money actually going to the platform owners. And then when you look at what is actually viewable and that people recall, it's fairly minimal. And certainly in our work, and I'll show you the numbers in a figure, particularly on sort of digital display in all its forms, this goes a long way to accounting really the horrendous ROIs that tend to come from digital display for most companies. I'll skip over that, it's been said before, but it does go to the heart of the measurement angle of this, trying to get hold of the numbers that prove the value of marketing. And I think the analogy is Finding Nemo, but it's, when you're looking at different divisions, perhaps in a retailer that is not necessarily just online, but online and offline in particular, where there's sort of different marketing teams. You've got the e-commerce team. The e-commerce team will have a digital attribution model that is basically attributing everything to a digital touch point. There is a massive bias in doing that. It is inflating the ROI scores. Whereas actually probably the group marketing function will have perhaps some mixed modelling. Very often that we do a lot of retail work, but it's actually saying that the digital ROIs are significantly less than what the e-commerce team think it is. Now the right way to pull this together is that actually the scaling of the digital ROI, let's say it's 10% of sales from a mixed model, then the digital attribution that provides the detail of sort of placement and creative, in different formats, that should be rescaled back to the econometric work. I think Forrester and the likes, they'll talk about the unified model that represents. So you've got the best of both worlds in the overall allocation, but you've also got the digital detail when done right from a digital attribution model. And this is a real example. It's actually a US airline, but we have plenty of examples. If you put it together in that way, this looks at cost per acquisition, but replace that for ROI if we're using that language. If you look at via the old analysis, i.e. not using that unified model approach versus doing it correctly, the whole pecking order of where you would put your money is massively changed. It's almost the inverse of what they were doing historically, and the profit upside from that was absolutely huge. To go to those numbers that I referred to, we have a collaboration with ThinkBox. As I say, we are completely independent. The origins of that collaboration about 10 years ago was that in the conversations that have been had, and it was before I worked at Ebiquity, we're saying that we have a huge database of spend and ROI results that actually shows that TV is coming out on top, and basically they're paying us for that and the sort of reformatting of those numbers. What we're seeing is in terms of, I'll just define short term here, so this is through the sort of conventional modelling in the industry where you use ad stock modelling, so you're effectively looking at the impact up to 6 months from the deployment of the media, which actually isn't capturing everything. The long term plus 2 or 3 years, we do measure it, and we do that for companies, as they talked about DLG before. But these are the figures from the most recent update of that. You can see, TV heading it, actually radio and print. I mean, really, print has been the first casualty, hasn't it? My brothers are both journalists, and they're fearing for their jobs at the moment as editors of papers. But the TV industry has certainly been protecting itself better, particularly in the UK with the work from ThinkBox. But you're looking at online display there, it is far, far less efficient, and there's significant overspend for many companies in that area. Just to explain these curves, because probably in the sort of media planning world, you're used to curves with sort of saturation points, where you can see that TV, because of the reach that you can generate, it will saturate at a much higher level of spend. This is actually just looking at the marginal returns. So as it starts to flatten those curves, then the ROI at that point is the gradient of the line. So basically what it's saying, as you increase spend, then TV on top, you can go a long way before it is it's at the point where it would make sense ordinarily, and these are just averages, it would be different company by company, of course, to actually spend on different channels. Can't remember what that said, which is why I read it, and I can't read my screen down here. The other, in the last update, actually with ThinkBox, we're also modelling out, and we're collaborating, partnering with Game Theory and doing this as well, of not just looking at the short term. So that last chart's looking at short-term impact, looking at the long-term impact. And you can see at a channel level, and this will be sort of linked obviously to the content on those channels as well, that the long-term impact from TV is significantly enhanced. And again, just in terms of the consumer experience, particularly with the huge TV sets we can now buy from AO.com and your competitors, the experience in the living room is very different from how we're consuming a lot of the digital media. So the memory effects that are coming through from that, you would expect to be larger, and that should be no surprise. So from the work we were doing that's specific to the UK in terms of the balance of spend, what we were finding that of that 450 million sort of opportunity, if the allocation is correct, we're looking at pointing to about a 39% increase in the share of TV. And again, this is just based at this point on looking at the short-term impact and not including the further long-term impact, where actually these figures would increase further. So 39% for finance, FMCG 27%, and retail about 18%. Obviously it depends on the nature of the retailer and actually where the sales are done, it goes without saying. And that's basically the sort of UK component of the entire GDP of Slovenia, which is where we started. Okay, thank you.